I want to thank Mrs. Parhad for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank Professor Abbas Milani and Stanford's Hamid and Christina Mogaddam program in Iranian Studies for inviting me to talk about my book and the impact of cholera on Iranian history. Can everybody hear me? Yep, it's working. Great. I was just telling Professor Milani that about, we met on this month 17 years ago. And he was my guest at Yale. So this must be Providence at work. I only found that out after I was checking something in one of your old books that you signed to me, and it was dated April 2002. So Providence was at work to have me here on April 17 years later as your guest. So thank you. Cholera, as many of you know, has been at the center of the news cycle, stretching from war-ravaged Yemen to post-cyclone Mozambique. But today I will not be talking about the ongoing epidemics of cholera. Rather, I'll tell you the story of the profound influence of this disease in shaping modern Iran in the 19th and 20th century by transforming its institutions, governance, and perspectives on medicine, disease, and public health. Before we get into the history, let me tell you a little bit about the disease. Cholera is an infectious disease caused by a strain of this comma-shaped bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. It is generally acquired through the consumption of contaminated food and water. And within a matter of hours, the bacterium can colonize the small intestine, where it produces a toxin that causes profuse diarrhea and vomiting that can last for days. The rapidity of its ability to colonize the intestines is often credited for why this disease takes on epidemic proportions so quickly. The extreme dehydration caused by the infection eventually makes the victim appear cadaveric with sunken eyes, grayish blue complexions. It used to be known as the Blue Death. And I think amongst the many infectious diseases, cholera is the closest disease to the fictional zombification that we see in sitcoms like The Walking Dead. So in many ways, its victims appear like the living dead, and often people were buried even though they had not died because they just looked dead. So it's a dramatic disease. It's aptly spectacular in terms of its symptomology, and which is why throughout history, both in East and West, it's played such a profound role relative to other diseases in shaping the course of history. Delirious and bedridden, the victims become a shadow of their former selves, sometimes in a matter of hours, searing terrifying memories of the illness on both survivors and caretakers alike. And without treatment, they often succumb to rapid dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, systemic shock, and death. Now, there are many different biotypes of cholera, but only a few biotypes cause pandemic outbreaks that can spread across countries and continents. 7 cholera pandemics have been recorded since 1816, all of which are thought to have originated in the brackish waters of the Bengal Peninsula, the Ganges Delta and the Bengal region of the Indian subcontinent. Now, the disease probably evolved over millennia because of a combination of this sort of alkaline and brackish nature of the water and a particular ecology in that area. But it was Britain's territorial expansion into that area, into India, and its growing commercial pursuits in the Persian Gulf and the Indian subcontinent at the cusp of the 19th century that allowed this disease to break out of this isolated endemic home and take on pandemic proportions. although Britain played a key role in the spread, it was the relative stability and security that followed the founding of the new Qajar dynasty that allowed pandemic cholera to spread for the first time from Iran's coast into the heart of the country and onwards to the west in 1821. Now, for the uninitiated, Iran had gone through almost a century of civil war, unrest, instability since the de facto fall of the Safavid dynasty in 1721. The reconstitution of central authority under Agha Muhammad Khan Qajar and his successor Fath Ali Shah at the cusp of the 19th century ended these decades of intermittent civil war, fractured rule, and isolation that had followed the fall of the Safavid dynasty. The re-establishment of transnational relationships, such as the 1801 treaty with the British East India Company and the opening of traffic on Iran's main commercial highways, allowed the disease that would have otherwise extinguished on Iran's coast to travel through the heart of the country and reach the major cities in the north and travel onwards to the west. This newfound stability opened the country to nationwide outbreaks of pandemic cholera almost every decade, from cholera's advent in 1821 to its attenuation after the First World War. Now, when Iranians first encountered the disease, they attributed the new contagion to an immutable act of God, although astral misalignment, humoral imbalance, and other theoretical constructs existed side by side with religious notions of disease causation. Allopathic medicine at the time was mainly humoral medicine, and for those who might not know what humoralism is, it's basically the originally Greek idea that was refined by Avicenna that disease is caused by an imbalance in the body's four elemental humors. Although the allopathic medicine was mainly humoral, the degradation of the practice of medicine during the century of civil war that preceded the rise of the Qajars largely made the access to allopathic doctors almost impossible for most people in Iran. There was only few of them left. As a result, and because of the dominance of religious views on the disease, much of the response of the government and the population in 1821, and for the most of the Qajar period for that matter, was to abandon the diseased cities for the perceived safety of the healthier countryside. During the 1892 outbreak, for example, about a fifth of Tehran's approximately 200,000 population sought refuge in the surrounding mountain villages. The dominant religio-cultural perspectives on the etiology of cholera began to change following Russia's victories over Iran in 1813 and 1828. Because of territorial disputes, Russia and Iran, Imperial Russia and Iran went to war twice in the early 19th century. Both ended up as defeats for the Iranians. And this galvanized the elite in Iran to seek Western advances in engineering, science, surgery, and therapeutics, culminating in the founding of Iran's first European-styled polytechnic college, the Dar al-Funun, in 1851 by Nasiruddin Shah's reforming premier Mirza Taqi Khan Amir Kabir to train Iran's new cadre of military officers. But Amir Kabir, who had been the chief administrator of the country's northern army and had experienced the terrible impact of the 1846 cholera epidemic on troops, realized that the need for competent medical personnel in the military. As a result, the new academy's curriculum also included education in the natural sciences and medicine. European physician instructors at the Polytechnic College would often fulfill the twin roles of being professors and chief royal physicians, or Hakim Bashi, making them especially influential among the country's power brokers. And I'm going to give you two examples of this. The first one is Jakob Edward Pollack, one of the 6 newly arrived Austrian instructors at the Polytechnic College. He was a military physician in Austria. And upon his arrival in Iran, he very quickly experienced the impact of the 1852 cholera epidemic and high casualty rates it caused amongst Iran's troops. He very graphically describes this in his memoirs about troops being just left to die with a jug of water on the roadsides on the way on their march to Tehran. And this pushed him to write his first medical treatise prior to the ending of the 1852 epidemic on cholera, which included the latest European findings on its etiology and hygienic interventions to prevent its spread. This led to the establishment of the standards, of the first standards of hygiene in Iranian barracks, such as covering the floor with charcoal during times of epidemic, drinking water from its source, and disposal of refuse at a distance from the barracks. Pollack was followed, the successor to Pollack was Joseph Désiré Tolosane, who was Nasser-Eddin Shah's new French physician, who also took over Pollack's teaching responsibilities at the Polytechnic College in 1860. Tolosane had been a senior professor at the military teaching hospital of Val-de-Grâce in Paris, a veteran of the Crimean War, and a distinguished scholar of epidemic diseases who considered major improvements in Iran's medical education to be crucial to its sanitary progress and its ability to combat cholera. He advocated replacing widely referenced tomes such as Ibn Sina or Avicenna's Canon of Medicine and Imam Reza's Golden Dissertation of Medicine with translations of the latest European publications on medicine and public health. By mid-century, the science of epidemiology had allowed people like John Snow and his contemporaries to map the link between water and cholera. Even though the germ theory of disease had not come to pass, there was a broad realization that that contaminated water was somehow linked to the disease. And these hygienic theories begin to be introduced to the Iranian readers and students through people like Pollack and Tolosane. The foundation of popular hygiene in Iran, as Tolosane saw it, depended on substituting traditional Galenic humoral ideas with newer hygienic theories from the West, such as John Snow's waterborne model of cholera transmission, which were informed by more precise epidemiological interventions. Other innovations at this time, such as the printing press, the telegraph, and newspapers, familiarized Iran's population with the sanitary revolution in the West during the second half of the 19th century. Articles in the Iranian government weekly regularly informed its readers of efforts by civic leaders in the West in places like London, Copenhagen, and even as far away as Kingston, Jamaica, to have their streets and sewers cleaned to reduce the impact of epidemic outbreaks. Iran also began to regularly participate in international sanitary conferences on pandemic cholera that occurred almost every decade, beginning with the first conference in Istanbul or Constantinople in 1866. This sanitary globalization gradually transformed the Qajar regime's notions of its obligations to disease prevention, especially in light of the reported successes of European governments in halting the spread of the disease. This culminated under Nasseruddin Shah and the creation of the Iranian Sanitary Council in 1867 to advise the government on how to prevent cholera, and established prevention and public health as a social institution in Iran almost half a century after the pandemic cholera first swept across the country. However, the growing sanitary workforce, international engagements, and knowledge of the disease's waterborne nature did not change the continued ingress of pandemic cholera in the second half of the 19th century. Proposals to improve the sanitary infrastructure of the country were largely ignored because of the Qajar regime's administrative crises and financial deficits, which had worsened with the country's growing economic globalization in the second half of the 19th century, which brought flooded the Iranian market with cheap industrial goods to the detriment of Iran's economy that was already overburdened by reparation payments to Imperial Russia as a result of 2 defeats in its wars. Cheap goods were not the only thing that came with industrialization. Iran's integration into the steam-driven international marketplace and the opening of the Karun River, which is around here, and the opening of the Karun River to international commerce in the latter quarter of the 19th century accelerated the reach accelerated the reach of cholera to its borders, while the country's unaddressed infrastructural susceptibilities amplified the disease's domestic impact. In 1889, the steamship connections between Bombay, Basra, and then down to southern Iran and Bushehr basically transported the disease so fast the Iranians were not able to establish the requisite quarantines because now the disease had steam to give it speed. Same thing happened about 3 years later during the 1892 pandemic, where basically pilgrimage routes transported the disease from India to Mashhad, a center of Shiite pilgrimage, and then before the disease could even reach Tehran, it traveled through newly established trans-Caspian railway lines and steamship routes through the Caspian Sea to the west of the country, reaching Tabriz and the Gilan province before the disease had even reached Tehran overland. So you see the role of industrial transportation as being a real potentiator and giving the disease velocity like it had never had before in the late 19th century. Other more religio-cultural issues, such as belief that running water or water of a certain volume could not be defiled, so-called abekur, which is about 350 liters, worsened the epidemics in Iran. There was these religious beliefs that water of a certain volume, as long as it meets this volume requirement, could not be defiled, could not be infected, it's pure to drink. The same religious standards existed with running water. Moreover, in urban areas, which were mainly supplied by the Qanat water system, this water system that came from outside of the cities often had vertical shafts connected to them, which could easily get them contaminated and came awfully close to the surface, which again made them prone to getting contaminated in urban areas. Other aspect of urban areas which made Iranian cities particularly vulnerable to this disease included low-lying bathhouses, and overland sewage systems and gutters, so-called jubes, that were vulnerable to contamination. These vulnerabilities played out in 1892. This is a map of Tehran during 1892, during the epidemic there, where the caravan of Nasir al-Mulk, an aristocrat who had gone on pilgrimage to Mashhad, basically overland transports cholera with his caravan to the city. And once it reaches near its household, a body is washed very close to a Qanat source And once the this main qanat source is infected, the cholera epidemic basically follows the pattern of the qanat waterway across the country, across the city of Tehran in 1892, infecting all of the major districts that are supplied by the qanats. Now, during the 1892 epidemic, Tehran had about a 10% mortality rate, which is a pretty high mortality rate. But throughout the history of cholera in Iran, there was variance in terms of death rates between the different waves and among different cities because of various vulnerabilities and the virulence of the particular strain coming into the country. During the same epidemic, for example, the city of Rasht lost about a fourth of its population. Particularly hard hit were women and children. And one of the theories I have was that these women and children were the major workforce in the rice paddies. And again, because of the fecal oral contamination, were more prone to getting the disease. Because most people's reaction to the epidemic was to leave the city, including the government, there was an almost complete absence of civic leadership during these outbreaks, permitting local forces to subvert the central government's authority and revealing the country's deteriorating state of governance in the latter quarter of the 19th century. The epidemics also unmasked simmering anger at the West's growing stranglehold over the country's commerce. This manifested itself in episodes of violence against European financial interest and religious minorities, such as Armenians, that had the diplomatic protection of Western powers. Shiite clerics were particularly effective in mobilizing popular discontent in the wake of the epidemic, and they cemented their roles as leaders against Western encroachment and government exploitation at the time. This manifested itself during the tobacco protest in 1891, which led to the repeal of a monopoly granted to an English company for the manufacture and sale of tobacco in Iran. Some of the initial accusations against Nasser-Din Shah during this time did not center on the monopoly and the concession itself, but on the poor sanitary state of the country. And clerics often used disease and linked the disease state of the country to the presence of impure infidels in the country. So essentially using a disease as a tool to enhance their authority. And it's very interesting and very telling of what would happen almost a century later during the 1979 revolution. Similarly, Iran's secular dissidents in this period used Western norms of public service, including interventions against cholera, as a yardstick to evaluate and criticize the government. At the cusp of the 20th century, Iran's literate strata increasingly understood the science of microbes, their pathologies, and ways to prevent germs-borne illnesses thanks to a growing number of Western-trained native physicians, as well as the expansion of medical writing in Iranian newspapers and periodicals. This is actually a picture from a newspaper called Akhtar from 1890, and its depiction of germs. And Iranians tend to be attracted to these sort of colorful descriptions, and even illiterate Iranians would often say that they could spot germs in the atmosphere looking through telescopes. So they got the whole microscope telescope thing mixed up. This was reported by American Presbyterian missionaries in places like Yazd. I always chuckle because this was sort of the intersection of humoral theories of somehow infected atmosphere causing humoral imbalance and germs being in the atmosphere playing sort of this sort of imaginary role in people's minds as the germ theory was taking hold in the population. But because of the rise of the germ theory, reformers increased their demands for the government to invest in the country's sanitary infrastructure. However, continued political and economic paralysis largely prevented the realization of these demands. The Qajar administration's persistent inability to translate intellectual progress into lasting institutional and infrastructural reforms for public health perpetuated Iran's vulnerability to cholera pandemics at a time when large-scale outbreaks were increasingly rare in the West because of urban reform. Most prominently, I know at least we have one Parisian in the audience, Baron Haussmann, under Napoleon III, totally reshaped Paris, reshaped the way water was coming to Paris, opened up the boulevards, mainly motivated by a desire to reduce epidemic outbreaks. And it worked. Iranians knew about this. They were reading about this. Reports were being sent by Iranian representatives in Paris. Yet this knowledge was never translated into actual implementable action. In response to a nationwide cholera outbreak in 1904, secret revolutionary societies like the Anjuman-e-Makhfi began drawing attention to the deficit sanitary state of the country and attacked the government of Mozaffareddin Shah for the unremitting ingress of epidemics and the poor sanitary state of public health in Iran. Now, I've talked about the demographic, intellectual, and institutional impacts of cholera. Let me touch briefly on the economic impact by focusing on the 1904 outbreak. The 1904 outbreak had a direct impact on Iran's worsening economy in the year leading up to the constitutional revolution that started a parliamentary system in Iran. The epidemic caused double-digit inflation, a 33% increase in the price of sugar, and a 90% appreciation in the cost of wheat. The country faced near-famine conditions, and the economic freefall and the government's inability to address popular expectations really generated the public protests that culminated in the constitutional revolution of 1906. And I think the conversation in academia about the role of disease and the role of cholera in contributing to the constitutional revolution has been completely missing, at least based on my reading of affairs. I don't know if you'll agree with me, Professor Milani. I've been very negative about Iran and Iranians and its leadership, but Iranians were not all to blame. And this is the imperialism part of my book. European imperial rivalries, particularly growing economic and political efforts by Russia and Britain to dominate the region, a process known as the Great Game, also increased Iran's susceptibility to cholera and hindered improvements in public health at the cusp of the 20th century. Iran's worsening financial condition, which I've explained to you in the last quarter of the 19th century, obliged Tehran to increasingly subordinate its sanitary regime on its frontiers to imperial interests. And basically what happened was, the southern quarantines of Iran were in Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, and Mohammara were handed largely to the British and the British Navy because they had the sea power basically to patrol the south of the country. And in the northeast, much of the quarantines were run by the Russians because they had the troops and the infrastructure, the tents, mobile tents and mobile units that could establish large-scale quarantines on Iran's eastern frontier fairly rapidly. But eventually, these establishments were subordinated to the strategic goals of the great powers, and they were used to accomplish their economic and political gains in the region. For example, the Russians would use their quarantines in the east to divert trade from Iran into their own territory and to harass British merchants coming in. On the other hand, the British down south refused to establish requisite quarantines when they were needed because they desperately fought, not only in the case of Iran's quarantines, but generally at international sanitary conferences, to establish any onerous quarantine policy that might somehow get in the way of their commercial activity in the Persian Gulf. So what we see basically happening is that economics, political and strategic goals take precedence over the health of the Iranian population by the great powers. Britain and Russia resolved their decade-old Cold War in Iran with the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention that divided Iran into agreed-upon zones of influence between the two powers, basically the British sphere being here, the Russian sphere here. This essentially transformed Iran into a proto-colony that left little room for the second Majlis, under the constitutional government. It was a reformist Majlis, to enact the far-reaching structural reforms they needed to halt the ingress of epidemics of cholera and other diseases. Iran's failure, its failure to forge an independent sanitary course, prolonged its susceptibility to pandemic outbreaks that continued to decimate its population and economy, particularly during the First World War. Iran was ostensibly a neutral country going into the First World War. However, its territory became a battlefield between the belligerents. First, with the Ottoman military moving west against their Armenian and Assyrian population and occupying parts of Iran. Soon after, in 1915, the Russians moved troops down the Caucasus to meet the Ottomans and landed troops on the Caspian seashore. On the other hand, the British had to face Qashqai rebellion near their oil fields, so they landed sepoys and Indian troops and eventually established an almost 50,000 strong South Persia rifle brigades answerable to British officers. And as this map in 1916 shows, most of Iran, with the exception of this little bit, which actually had, which was occupied by Axis and Ottoman powers, nearly most of Iran was occupied by both Russian and the British in 1916, and all of the country was basically a battlefield. Occupying military forces requisitioned foodstuff and disseminated epidemics as they freely traversed and fought on Iranian territory. I won't go through all of that, but the resulting displacement and famine worsened the occurrence and lethality of both local and imported infectious diseases, including almost yearly cholera epidemics between 1914 and 1918. Now, I have to say that on the issue of famine is a sort of a popular issue in Iranian historiography. I think Dr. Milani and I agree that it's very difficult to say where the famine began and where the disease ended, so to say. Certainly, the presence of troops had a lot to do with the famine, but Iran had really sort of poor governance and low yield of crops, and it was not just something perpetuated by the British to sort of cause the genocide of Iranians, so to say, but it was just a wartime situation of Iran as a country occupied and poor governance in the country that led to poor crop yields. But what we do know was that these 3.5, 4 years of perpetual war in Iran led to widespread disease. And ironically, Iran, a neutral country, lost as many citizens to war-related diseases as belligerent countries lost in the trenches. Now, history tends to be very funny and interesting, at least I think so. Somewhat unexpectedly, the departure of European physicians to join their respective armies allowed a new generation of patriotic, European-trained native doctors who had been stifled by their European counterparts in Iran to lead the country's public health reform. Prior to World War I, the Iranian Sanitary Council, which I mentioned before, which was Iran's main advisorial body on public health and sanitation in the country, was led by European physicians. Almost by custom, it was led by the chief French physician to the Shah of Iran. But with the departure of all of these physicians to join the respective armies on the Western Front, this opened a road for a new generation of patriotic Iranian doctors to take over. And Amir Alam epitomized this new class of influential medical technocrats. Following advanced clinical training and research at the military teaching hospital of Val-de-Grâce in Paris, Amir Alam returns home in 1906 to teach at the Polytechnic College. Here, actually, he's teaching physiology. I figured this out by looking at the blackboard, because he's showing the heart and the lungs. I mean, this is typical physiology of the heart and lungs to medical students at the Polytechnic College. That's the advantage of being teaching preclinical science. But he returns home to teach at the Polytechnic College in 1906, but he also represents his native Mashhad at the Second National Assembly in 1909, where he shapes two landmark public health laws: the Hygiene and Smallpox Vaccination Act, the Qanun Hifz Sehat va Abil Kubi, and the Medical Practice Act, Qanun Tibabat, ratified in 1910 and 1911. And it's interesting because the Qanun Tibabat, for the first time, makes medical practice, regulates medical practice in Iran in 1911. Prior to 1911, you can hang a shingle and call yourself a doctor. After 1911, you actually have to show requisite certificates, educational background, experience, determined at that point by the Sanitary Council and the Ministry of Interior what met a standard of physician in Iran. So this was revolutionary under him. As the first president of the Iranian Sanitary Council, Amir Alam expanded and professionalized Iran's smallpox vaccination programs immediately after the war, despite the terrible conditions in the country after World War I. After World War I, and I don't use this lightly, Iran was a failed state. The government in Tehran could not project its power very far beyond Tehran's walls. In the north of the country, in Gilan, there was a secessionist Soviet Republic of Gilan led by the Jangali movement. Literally, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Gilan in the north, independent of the central government. In the south, Sheikh Ghazal had established a sheikhdom around in the area of Mohammara. So the country was centripetally breaking apart. And so the country was terrible. Nevertheless, in the midst of this chaos, Amir Alam was still able to increase the country's vaccination system. And I think this is a good lesson for some of our contemporary public health practitioners, and I think they've learned this, who initially did not want to establish vaccination programs in Yemen in the early days of war because they feared access. Had they known the history of vaccination under Amir Alam, they would have established it much quicker. Today, it's now accepted, even though there's two different authorities and there's still war in Yemen. Vaccination is the word of the day against cholera. Nevertheless, improvements in the vaccination program under Amir Alam was not enough, and the Iranians were incapable of comprehensively reforming the country's public health under worsening economic and political circumstances after the war, and they remained vulnerable to outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. But this changed with the rise of the Pahlavi regime, which rose out of the ashes of the Qajar dynasty after the armistice that followed World War I, and rapidly stabilized the country's administration, finances, and security. And this improved domestic security under Reza Khan returned trade and agrarian life to its pre-war level. Reza Khan defeated the secessionist, socialist movements in the north, brought Sheikh Ghazal to heel, put an end to banditry on highways, pacified a lot of the rebellious tribes, and by doing this, brought agrarian life and trade to normal. So much so that in a short span of time, and especially with the modernization of treasury and revenue collection, Iran was able to balance its budget in 1925. This is radical, because this had not happened for almost 100 years. This ended the vicious cycle of deficit and borrowing and allowed Tehran to develop the infrastructure of sanitation and public health in urban areas by building on the administrative and intellectual developments in public health established in the post-constitutional period. It also allowed Tehran to take over the contested British-run quarantines in the south, which the British had resisted. The Russian quarantines had pretty much melted away after the Russian Revolution in the east. Tehran's patronage at this time of the newly inaugurated Pasteur Institute of Iran gave the government the capability of domestic vaccine production to immunize vulnerable populations during outbreaks of Asiatic cholera. The effective fielding of both domestically produced and foreign purchased vaccines in 1927 limited the impact of the 1927 epidemic, which had ravaged neighboring Iraq, limited the impact in Iran to about 700 deaths. The creation of the Razi State Serum and Vaccine Institute, the country's first domestic pharmaceutical company in 1931, multiplied the domestic reach and vaccine production capabilities of the government. When cholera returned to Iran in 1931 and again in 1939, it no longer had the devastating impact of the epidemics of the 19th and early 20th century, with only a few hundred deaths in both cases. This marked the end of Iran's age of cholera, but it certainly isn't the end of our story. In 1966, the WHO commended the Iranian government for its response to a new and virulent El-Tor strain of pandemic cholera that had invaded the country's east the year prior through India, originating the El-Tor strain at that time had originated in Indonesia and had traveled east through India, Afghanistan, and into Iran. The Iranian government largely halted the outbreak in 1965 after several months of aggressive immunizations with domestically produced vaccines, prophylactic antibiotic use with chloramphenicol, which actually was at the time counterindicated in the United States because it was thought to be toxic, and quarantine. So aggressive and heroic interventions. It is notable that Iran, at least in the rural areas in the 60s where most of the people lived, had not significantly upgraded its sanitary infrastructure. That meant that other undertakings, particularly the government's vaccination campaign, played an oversized role in stopping the pandemic. This is important to note because in the history of cholera, sanitation gets an oversized credit for ending the age of pandemics. And this calls for a reevaluation of the non-Western experience with cholera, because we see, in the case of Iran, that biological interventions, such as the use of antibiotics and the use of vaccination, actually plays a bigger role than infrastructural change in bringing an end and stopping epidemic outbreaks. It's also a lesson I think anti-vaxxers could learn in this area, certainly, with our measles outbreak. Iran's industrial neighbor at the time, during the 65, the Soviet Union did not fare as well, where the pandemic slowly crawled westward through the Russian heartland in the ensuing 5 years, reaching Crimea in 1970. So the Soviet Union didn't stop the pandemic the same way the Iranians had. Iran's relative success against the El-Tor pandemic was built on the foundations of modern biomedicine and administration that were established in the Qajar period. The Pasteur and Razi Institutes owed their existence to the emergence of public health as a professional discipline and a triumph of the germ theory of disease in Iran at the turn of the 19th century. The country's modern medical workforce and laboratory infrastructure, also established in that period, allowed the Iranian government to rapidly detect and indigenously manufacture an effective vaccine to contain the cholera outbreak. This would have not been possible without Tehran's constructive technical collaboration with the World Health Organization in 1965, built on a century of international sanitary engagements, dating from Iran's participation in the first international sanitary conferences against cholera in 1866, 100 years prior to the outbreak in 1965. The vaccine's delivery on a national scale relied on an organized network that had its origins in Iran's successful countrywide smallpox immunization efforts in the years after the First World War. The Iranian Ministry of Public Health, which had directed the government's campaign against the pandemic, traced its institutional roots to the Sanitary Council that first convened almost 100 years earlier to stop the spread of Asiatic cholera. The story of cholera also has important implications for Iran's current record-level opiate addiction epidemic. I don't know how many of you know, but Iran has one of the highest per capita opiate addiction rates in the world, puts our opiate epidemic to shame. Iran's common border with Afghanistan, the world's largest opium producer, has made the drug and its derivatives readily and cheaply available to consumers, just as Iran's shared border with India in the 19th century, the endemic home of cholera, made it vulnerable to regular invasions of the pandemic over a century ago. Iran's counter-narcotic efforts are paralyzed by the same types of corruption, rigid ideological and turf wars in the government and security apparatus that hindered Tehran's ability to stop the spread of cholera in 1904. An on-again, off-again, draconian and religiously inspired punitive and unscientific approach to the problem, using imprisonments and executions, have only doubled the population of addicts in the last 7 or 8 years. And this is not the WHO reporting, this is the Islamic Republic's parliament reporting that the population of addicts in the last 8 years has doubled. Much as the religious beliefs in water purity worsened the cholera epidemics in the 19th century. Just as Iran's diplomatic missteps with European imperial powers worsened its vulnerability to cholera, its current decades-old hostility towards the United States and its interventionist policies in the region has deprived Tehran of critical intelligence and coordinated cross-border police action that could reduce the flow of narcotics across its frontiers. The only way to address this problem is for the Islamic Republic not only to embrace a scientifically informed public health approach to the problem, but even more broadly to change its illiberal approach to the current social, economic, and political determinants of addiction. Now, I'm amongst friends, so I will be provocative, admittingly. And the question I will throw out at you with a smile on my face is, if Tehran does not address this problem, could the growing epidemic of drug use and hopelessness trigger a larger political movement that could bring an end to the 40-year theocracy, just as the 1904 epidemic brought an end to Iran's uninterrupted history of absolutism? Thank you very much.